March 31st, 1993. It looked like just another normal day on a film set. Lights were in place, cameras were ready, crew members were moving around doing their jobs. Everything felt routine, controlled, predictable. And in the middle of it all stood a young actor named Brandon Lee, preparing to shoot a scene that, on paper, was nothing special. Just another moment in a dark revenge story where his character gets shot, falls to the ground, and the director calls cut. But what no one knew at that moment was that this scene would not end with a cut. It would end in silence, confusion, and a real death that would shock the entire world. Because within hours, Brandon Lee would be gone at just 28 years old. And to understand how something like this could happen, you have to go back and understand who Brandon really was. Because he wasn't just another actor trying to make it in Hollywood. He was the son of Bruce Lee, a global icon, a legend in martial arts and cinema, a man whose shadow was so large that it followed Brandon everywhere he went. And growing up with that kind of legacy is not an advantage the way people think it is. It's pressure, it's expectation, it's constantly being compared, constantly being told you're not enough, that you'll never match what came before you. And Brandon heard all of that. He saw how people looked at him, not as an individual, but as an extension of his father. And instead of breaking under that weight, he chose to fight it. He trained in martial arts. He worked on his acting. He took roles that challenged him, slowly building a path that was his own, not borrowed, not inherited, but earned. And by the early 1990s, that effort was starting to pay off. He was gaining recognition. People were beginning to see him not just as Bruce Lee's son, but as Brandon Lee, an actor with his own presence, his own intensity. And then came the opportunity that seemed like it would change everything. A film called The Crow, dark, emotional, visually unique, and centered around a character who comes back from the dead to avenge his and his fiance's murder. It was the kind of role that could define a career. And for Brandon, it felt like the moment where everything he had worked for would finally come together. The chance to step out of the shadow and stand on his own. Filming began, and by all accounts, things were going well. The atmosphere on set was professional, focused, the crew experienced, the scenes coming together as planned. And as the days passed, no one had any reason to think that anything was wrong, until the day they filmed one of the most important scenes. A moment where Brandon's character returns home and is confronted by enemies. A gun is pointed at him. A shot is fired, and he falls. It was supposed to be simple, routine, the kind of scene that had been done hundreds of times in countless films. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous, just another controlled illusion. But what happened next was anything but controlled. As the cameras rolled and the scene played out, the gun was fired. Brandon reacted, and everything seemed perfect. The timing, the performance, the execution, it all looked right. The director called cut, and for a brief moment, it felt like just another successful take. But then something felt off. Brandon didn't get up. At first, it didn't alarm anyone. Actors sometimes stay in character. Sometimes they take a moment. But as seconds passed, concern started to grow. Someone called out to him. No response. Another crew member moved closer, realizing something was wrong. Panic began to spread. Voices got louder, urgent. "Brandon, are you okay?" "He's not moving. Call an ambulance." And suddenly, the line between fiction and reality shattered completely. Because this wasn't acting anymore. This was real. Brandon had been hit, actually hit, and no one understood how. He was rushed to the hospital. The set that had been filled with controlled chaos turned into a place of shock and disbelief, people asking the same question over and over again. How could this happen? This was supposed to be safe. Everything is checked. Everything is managed. But despite the rush, despite the effort, hours later, Brandon Lee was pronounced dead. And the film that was supposed to define his life became forever tied to his death. And as investigators began to look into what had happened, the truth that came out was not a single mistake, but a chain of failures. Small oversights that stacked on top of each other until they created something deadly. Because the weapon used in that scene
was a real .44 Magnum revolver. Something that might sound shocking to people outside the industry, but in Hollywood, real guns are often used for realism, with strict safety protocols in place. And on that day, those protocols failed. Earlier in the shoot, the gun had been loaded with what are called dummy rounds for close-up shots.
These are supposed to be harmless, designed to look like real bullets without the dangerous components. But in this case, they were not properly prepared. The powder had been removed, but the primer, a small explosive component, was left inside. And when the gun was triggered during a previous setup, the primer ignited just enough to push a bullet out of its casing and lodge it quietly inside the barrel, unnoticed, invisible, a hidden danger waiting for the next step. And that next step came when the crew prepared for the actual shooting scene, replacing the dummy rounds with blanks, which contained powder to create sound and flash, but no bullet. And under normal circumstances, that would be safe. But this was no longer a normal circumstance, because now there was already a real bullet stuck inside the barrel. And when the trigger was pulled, the explosion from the blank round provided enough force to propel that lodged bullet forward like a real shot, turning a controlled prop into a lethal weapon. And from a distance of less than 15 feet, it struck Brandon Lee in the abdomen, giving him no chance to survive. And just like that, a routine scene turned into a fatal incident, an illusion turned into reality, and the aftermath raised difficult questions about responsibility, about safety, about how something so preventable was allowed to happen. Investigations followed, examining every detail, every step, every decision, and while multiple failures were identified, the conclusion was that there wasn't enough basis for criminal charges, meaning no one was held legally responsible for Brandon's death, which only added another layer of frustration and tragedy to the story, because a young man lost his life not because of one intentional act, but because of a system that failed to protect him. And in a haunting twist of fate, this wasn't the first time tragedy had touched his life, because 20 years earlier, in 1973, a young Brandon had stood at his father Bruce Lee's funeral, saying goodbye to a legend. And now, 2 decades later, he would be laid to rest beside him. Father and son, both gone too soon, both leaving behind stories that the world would never forget. And The Crow, the film that was meant to be his breakthrough, was eventually completed using stand-ins and visual effects, and released as a tribute to his work, becoming a cult classic, forever linked to the man who never got to see its success. And when people watch it now, they don't just see a character returning from the dead, they see the eerie reflection of a real-life story where an actor gave everything to his role without ever knowing it would cost him his life. And that's what makes this story so unsettling, because it wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't part of the plan. It wasn't written in any script. It was a series of small mistakes, overlooked details, and broken safety checks that came together in the worst possible way. And it leaves behind a simple but uncomfortable truth, that sometimes it doesn't take something big to cause a tragedy. Sometimes it's the small things that get ignored, the quick decisions, the skipped checks, the moments where people assume everything is fine, and by the time anyone realizes it's not, it's already too late. And Brandon Lee's story stands as a reminder of that, a reminder that behind every film, every scene,